Hi everyone, it's Kathy. Thank you so much for joining me. Today I'll be creating a slimline card, doing some watercoloring with this beautiful sunflower stamp. And I had a couple of boo-boos along the way, and I've pretty much left all of them in just so you can see how I was able to fix them. Anyway, I started out with a piece of Canson watercolor cardstock that's cut to 3 inches by 8 inches. And then I inked up the sunflower stamp with milk chocolate hybrid ink from My Favorite Things. And being that the watercolor cardstock is textured, I am going to stamp this stamp a couple of times. I think I end up stamping it 3 times, just to make sure that I get a nice crisp impression. I chose not to emboss this image because there's so much detail in the petals that I was afraid that the embossing powder would get kind of chunky and I would lose some of that detail with the watercoloring. After I was done stamping that first sunflower, I did cover it with a mask, and I had actually used my scan and cut machine to cut out that mask, and it did a really good job. But you'll notice in just a moment, when I go to ink up the stamp and stamp it down, there's a little bit of an issue. I end up with a really big white space between the first and the second sunflower. And it's not a stamp issue, it's a mask issue. When I first saw that big white space, I wasn't too sure what I was going to do, but I wasn't going to start over. That's something that I'm really working on right now, is not starting over. So I stamped it a second time and attempted to do CPR on my MISTI to see if that would help. And the third time I pulled out my little rag to see if I used that, if I would get more ink above that mask. Then I try CPR again, and it's just not filling in the area. So what I end up doing is I remove the mask and then I scooch it down just a little bit. Now, by doing that, that means that I'm going to overstamp some of those petals from the first sunflower, but it's okay because I'll be able to fix it, and once I'm done with all of the watercoloring, you won't be able to tell that I stamped over the tips of those petals from the first sunflower. After I got that second sunflower done, I removed the mask and moved it, and since I learned my lesson from the previous mask issue, when I lined up the mask over the second sunflower, I automatically shifted it down a little bit so that the petals are sticking out. Then I ink up the stamp and I go to stamp the stamp and realize that I haven't moved the stamp, so I had to pick it up and move the stamp. Then I was able to finish up the stamping. After I got the sunflower stamped, I grabbed a couple of distress inks, and I'll make sure to have everything that I used listed in the description box below for you. Watercoloring is not necessarily one of my strengths, but I do love the look of it, and I have found the easiest way for me is to use distress inks, and a big part of that is I use too much water, and I know that, and I'm aware of that. But for this particular image, because it's so large, using a lot of water actually worked to my benefit because it really didn't take very long to color in these images. I am doing a wet on wet technique, which basically means I'm adding water to the cardstock first, and then with a wet paintbrush, I'm picking up the ink and then just dropping it into the image. The first color that I used is Wild Honey, and when I went to smush it onto my craft mat, I noticed my poor little ink pad is very dry. So I guess I'm going to have to put refills for that onto my shopping list. So as I added the color into the flower petals, I was trying to stay in my own lane and just let the water and the ink do what it does, and that is just move around. After I was done with the Wild Honey, I did bring in Rusty Hinge and added that in where I wanted to have the petals be a little bit darker and start to add in some definition for the petals. The easiest way that I found to do this was to add the Rusty Hinge to the petals that are set behind the other petals, and then on a couple of the petals I used the very tip of my paintbrush to outline them so that they would have a little bit more definition. I did wait until that first sunflower was completely dry before I brought in the Rusty Hinge so that I could layer up those colors and not end up with them just blending together. I finished up the rusty hinge on the second sunflower and added in the wild honey on the third sunflower. And while I was waiting for the wild honey on the third sunflower to dry, I grabbed a fine tip brown marker and added in a bunch of dots to fill in the halo that was created from the mask. The trick to doing this is, if you're doing watercoloring, you do want to make sure that you use a permanent waterproof marker. If it's not, once you go in to color in that area, the centers of the flowers, the ink will bleed. So once I had all those little dots drawn in, it was time to color in the center of the sunflowers. And again, I'm doing a wet on wet technique, and I am adding a decent amount of water to the center of the sunflowers. It's not soaking wet, but the cardstock is more than glistening. You can see that my Frayed Burlap ink pad is nice and juicy, so I was able to get quite a bit of ink on my craft mat to use for the center of the sunflowers. And I did the same thing for the other two centers. I did the wet on wet technique, got it wet, and then just dropped in the ink and let it do what it was supposed to do. For the background, I decided to use peacock feathers, and again, these are all the regular distress inks. I chose the distress inks over the oxide inks because they're a little bit more vibrant, because when the oxides dry, they tend to have that chalky finish. Anyway, for the background, you do definitely want to make sure that it is completely dry, and I let this panel air dry. I didn't want to use my heat tool because I didn't want the cardstock to warp any more than it already is. To color in the background, especially in these smaller areas where there's not a whole lot of color, I made sure to get that area wet with clean water first, and then use just a small amount of the pigment from the ink to fill it in. When I get up towards the top, I'll actually go ahead and create a water barrier around the petals of the sunflowers and then get the rest of the top of the cardstock wet. The reason that I created that water barrier is because the ink will only go where the paper is wet. And since the sunflowers were completely dry, I didn't have to worry about the peacock feathers ink bleeding all over my sunflowers. There was a spot where I had kind of dropped in a little bit too much ink, and I was trying to move it around and it wasn't moving as easily as I wanted to. So I cleaned off my brush, and with clean water I went back into where that area was pretty dark and just again pushed that pigment around. Unfortunately, by doing that, now my cardstock is even more warped and I'm getting a little bit of pooling along the side. So to soak up some of that ink, I just used a paper towel and set it right next to the side of the cardstock, and it soaked up that extra ink. Once I was done with adding in all of the color, I set the panel off to the side to dry. Again, it is completely dry at this point. I used Nuvo Deluxe adhesive to adhere the watercolored panel to a piece of navy cardstock that's cut to 3 1/4 by 8 1/4. And I put my MISTI on top just so that it would have some pressure, so that it would help flatten out the cardstock that was a tiny bit warped. I set that off to the side so that the glue had a chance to settle in and grab on really well, and I took a piece of navy blue cardstock and treated it with my anti-static powdered bag. I stamped my sentiment with VersaMark ink and coated it with detail white embossing powder, and used my heat tool to melt that until it was nice and shiny. I ran it through my die cut machine with a fishtail banner die, trimmed off the excess, and then adhered that to the front of the card using my tape runner. I adhered that panel to the front of my Slimline card, which started out at 8 1/2 by 7 inches, and then I scored it along the 7-inch side. So the finished card is 3 1/2 by 8 1/2. And for final touches and to balance out the left side of the card, I added just a few gold sequins. And that's it. That finishes up my card for today. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, I'd love it if you would. And don't forget to ring the bell so you're notified every time a new video is posted. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.